She begged for death. But death sent her something worse, someone who refused to let her die. The basement smelled of rust and concrete, of time that had stopped moving. Margaret's wrists bore the memory of rope, now replaced by silence so complete it became its own kind of cage. 3 years. 3 years since the accident that wasn't an accident. Since the husband who loved her learned to hate her. Since the world above forgot she existed. She wasn't thin anymore. She was translucent, a woman viewed through old glass, distorted and distant even from herself. The chains had been removed 6 months ago. Not from mercy, from resignation. Where would she run? Her captor had learned that terror, once deeply enough planted, didn't require reinforcement. It had roots now. It lived in her bones. Margaret sat on the mattress that had absorbed more of her than sleep. It held her despair the way earth holds the dead. Her fingers traced the window painted black, where no light had entered since the beginning. She counted the scratches on the wall instead, 4,217. Each one a day she'd chosen not to swallow the pills he left on the shelf. Mercy, he called it, a choice. Tonight, she would make the real choice. The bottle sat beside her, full and patient, 30 tablets. She'd read once that it was painless. She'd read that during the first week, when hope still visited. Now she didn't read anymore. She only waited. The sound came first, as vibration, something impossible in a place where sound had died, a crack in the world above. Then, footsteps on the stairs, but wrong, not his footsteps. His were heavy, deliberate, the sound of a man who owned everything he walked toward. These were different, lighter, as if the person descending was apologizing to each step for the weight they carried. Margaret didn't look up. Nothing in this basement surprised her anymore. Nothing mattered. "You're planning something beautiful," a voice said, male, accented, Eastern European, perhaps Russian, cultured. "I can smell it on you, the decision, the peace that comes before." She lifted her eyes. The man in her basement wore a charcoal coat that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. His face was anachronistic. It belonged to a painting, not to the modern world. Pale, sharp-boned, with eyes that held the color of old amber held against candlelight. He was impossibly still, the way predators are still before the kill. "Who are you?" Her voice was rusted from disuse. "Someone who recognizes the look," he said softly, descending the final steps. "I wore it once. For 200 years, I wore it." Margaret's hand moved toward the bottle. Some instinct, survival or cruelty she couldn't distinguish anymore, made her want to finish the act in front of him, to deny him whatever he'd come for. "I'm not here to stop you," the man continued, and something in his tone made her pause. It wasn't pity. Pity would have been unbearable. This was something older, recognition. "I'm here to tell you that death isn't the only door. Some of us learned to open another one. Some of us learned that eternity, however dark, is still a choice. And choice, real choice, is what separates the living from the truly dead." He moved closer, not threatening. There was no hunger in his approach. There was only sorrow. "My name is Victor," he said, "and I've been looking for someone like you for a very long time." The pills fell to the concrete floor. Margaret didn't know why she'd let them go, only that the moment this man, this thing, spoke her name, he hadn't, but he would. She knew he would. The chemical escape route had suddenly seemed like cowardice. "Why?" she whispered. Victor sat on the edge of the mattress, keeping distance she didn't know she needed. "Because I've walked long enough alone. Because I've watched people choose death when they had no power to choose anything else. And because some of us still believe that suffering, real, witnessed suffering, might be the only thing capable of breaking the curse." He pulled a small mirror from his coat. Glass so old it held a slight green tint, frame made of tarnished silver. He held it toward her, not forcing, only offering. Margaret's reflection was barely recognizable. She saw the cage in her face, not the basement cage, but the internal one, the architecture of despair that had been constructed brick by brick over 3 years. Sunken cheeks, eyes that had learned not to hope, hair that fell like dead things. "I'm broken," she said. "Yes," Victor agreed, and there was no comfort in his acceptance. "That's precisely why you interest me. The unbroken never understand what we need to become. They try to heal you. I'm offering something else. I'm offering transformation. Not forgiveness, not redemption, not yet. Just the possibility that your suffering might mean something. You're a vampire." It wasn't a question. "Since 1823, he said. I was turned in Prague by a man who promised me immortality would cure my cruelty. Instead, it preserved it. For a century and a half, I hunted because hunger demanded it. I fed because my nature required it. And then, perhaps 200 years ago, I can no longer distinguish. I stopped believing that this curse was meant to be suffered. I decided it might be meant to be used." He stood, moved to the painted window. His fingers touched the black paint without leaving marks. No fingerprints, no trace. A ghost of a man. "Your husband will come down these stairs tomorrow at 6, Victor said. "He always does. He brings food you won't eat and speaks to you about his day, speaking at you rather than to you. The way the living speak at monuments. Tomorrow, he won't find you. He'll find a door that was never there before. And he'll walk through it, and the moment his shadow crosses the threshold, he'll understand that there are consequences for building cages." "You'll kill him," Margaret said. "I'll make him understand the difference between life and living," Victor corrected. "And then, Margaret, if you choose, if you truly choose, you can walk out of this basement as something other than what walked in. Not healed, never healed, but remade into something that refuses to be broken again." He extended his hand. It was warm. She'd expected coldness. This betrayed something she couldn't name. "The choice is yours," he said. "The pills are still on the floor, or the door, or the chains. I could rebuild them if you prefer the familiar. Some people do. After enough time in captivity, freedom becomes its own kind of terror." Margaret looked at his hand. She thought of 3 years of rope and darkness. She thought of the pills and the peace they promised. She thought of the word transformation, how it sounded like burning and becoming and breaking into something sharper. She took his hand. The transformation began as thirst, not for water or sustenance, for something older than hunger, for truth, for the world in ways her human senses had never permitted. Victor's apartment existed in a space that seemed to exist outside of time. Victorian Prague, layered with modern Berlin, with echoes of other cities she recognized from his accent but not from any geography. The walls held paintings that shouldn't exist, scenes from centuries not yet lived, rendered in oils and gold leaf. "What am I?" she asked, standing before a mirror that actually reflected her now, but changed. Her skin held the faintest luminescence, as if lit from within by candlelight. Her eyes had deepened to amber, to the color of his eyes. "In transition," Victor said. He stood behind her but didn't touch her. There was a protocol to immortality, he'd explained. Hunger came first, then clarity, then choice. "You're drowning in the old world. In a few hours, you'll either break the surface or sink entirely. Most people sink." Margaret's throat burned with a thirst that had no name. Every heartbeat in the apartment announced itself. Victor's slow, deliberate pulse, the neighbor's rapid panic through the wall, the blood moving through her own veins like a stranger's river. "How long does this last?" she asked. "Until you kill something," Victor said. "Until you choose whether the hunger owns you or you own it." He'd left a room prepared for her. Inside, a cage. Not like the basement cage. This one was ornate, Victorian, beautiful in the way torture can be beautiful. The door was open. He explained that the hunger would eventually override reason, and when it did, she'd need boundaries. "I won't lock you in," he said. "But you should consider locking yourself in. Most immortals do, their first night. The alternative is waking up covered in someone else's death and living with that. Forever is a very long time to carry unexpected blood on your hands." Margaret entered the cage. She closed the door. She didn't lock it, not yet, but she sat in its center and waited for the drowning to begin. It started around midnight. The hunger became something corporeal, something with teeth and weight. She could hear the city breathing outside, could hear each life moving through the night, joggers, insomniacs, lovers, the lonely. She could taste the copper distance of them, the specific flavor each person carried. Victor appeared with a glass of something dark. "This will help," he said. "Animal blood. It won't satisfy you completely. It's meant to sustain, not to fill. You need to understand what you're choosing before you taste human death." It was enough to break the edge of madness, enough to make thought possible again. "Why are you helping me?" Margaret asked between gasps. "Because I've learned that monsters don't become less monstrous through isolation," Victor said. "We only become more efficiently cruel. But if we choose to be monstrous together, if we witness each other's hunger and refuse to let it become casual, perhaps then there's something that resembles redemption. Not forgiveness. Never that. But a kind of meaning." He moved toward the window that overlooked Prague's night. The city sprawled below them, full of lives, full of choices. "Your husband died at 6:47 this evening," Victor said quietly. "He went into that basement looking for you. He found a door. He opened it. On the other side was every moment he'd ever made you suffer, played back in real time. It took him 4 minutes to understand. It took him another 3 to stop screaming. Then his heart simply declined to continue." Margaret felt nothing, no guilt, no relief. Only a strange neutrality, as if that part of her life had been sealed in amber and placed on a shelf somewhere. "I've already contacted the authorities," Victor continued. "They'll find the basement. They'll find evidence of someone else entirely. Your disappearance will remain unsolved. Your husband's death will be natural causes. His heart was weak after all. No one will ever know that you survived, that you chose something else." Margaret pressed her forehead against the cage bars. They were cool, real, anchoring. "And now, I invite you to leave a trace of your presence in the comments. Tell us where in the world you're watching from, and the exact hour you hear this story. We wish to know how far these immortal confessions travel, and at what moments of the night they find you." By the third night, Margaret could no longer remember what sunlight felt like. The human world had become a distant country she'd once visited. The hunger had evolved from agony into language, a way of speaking to the world, of understanding its texture and depth. Victor taught her the rules, not with words, but with demonstration. He moved through the city like a ghost, never taking more than necessary, never hunting those too weak to carry their own weight. He showed her how to taste the difference between desperate blood and vital blood, between those who wanted to die and those who fought for life. "The first kills is when most of us lose ourselves," he said. They stood in a concert hall after midnight, empty except for the two of them and the memory of music. We take too much. We take in anger. We take to prove something. And then we spend the next century trying to forgive ourselves for it. Margaret had already killed twice. The first time was a man who had the same hands as her husband, same thickness in the fingers, same way of reaching. The second was a woman who tasted like resignation, like someone who'd already chosen to disappear. Neither kill had felt like mercy. Neither had felt like crime. "What if I don't want forgiveness?" Margaret asked. Victor smiled. It was the first real smile she'd seen from him. Not the polite expression he wore in the world above, but something genuine. Something that held actual warmth. "Then we won't pursue it. That's the beauty of this, Margaret. You're no longer required to perform redemption for anyone. Not for God. Not for yourself, only for the choice you make each time you hunt. He brought her to a room she'd never entered. It was lined with mirrors, not reflective surfaces but paintings, portraits of faces, rendered in oils and charcoal, and something darker. Hundreds of them, thousands, each face bore a date. "Every person I've killed," Victor said simply, "since 1823. Their names are written on the back of each portrait. I look at them sometimes, not from guilt, from attention. Each one was a choice. Each one mattered. Each one changed me." Margaret walked the gallery of his dead. She saw a merchant from 1847, a servant girl from 1912, a soldier from 1943, a politician from 1987. Faces spanning centuries, painted with a precision that suggested Victor had looked at each one very carefully before and after their death. "You expect me to do this?" she asked. "I expect you to decide what kind of monster you want to be," Victor said. "Some immortals become forgetting machines. They kill and discard until centuries pass and they're hollow shells pretending to be alive. Some become obsessed with redemption and go mad trying to balance their cruelty with good works. And some, a very few, decide that their monstrosity deserves to be witnessed, that the only honest path is to look directly at what we are and refuse to look away." He handed her a blank canvas and charcoal. "Your first portrait," he said. "The man with your husband's hands. Look at him. Really look. Tell me what you see." Margaret drew through the night. She drew the specific curve of his jaw, the exact shade of violence in his eyes. She drew the scar on his neck that came from a knife wound he'd never quite healed from properly. She drew his hands, those terrible hands that had never touched her but had done violence to others. She drew him seen. When she finished, Victor hung it in the gallery. He wrote on the back, "Marcus Reiner, 2025, tasted like inherited cruelty, died because someone needed to remember him as something other than his worst impulses." "That's not mercy," Margaret said. "No," Victor agreed, "but it's attention. And attention, my dear, is the closest thing to mercy that monsters like us will ever achieve." By the 5th week, Margaret had stopped counting the nights. Time had become something fluid, measured in hunger cycles rather than calendar days. She existed in the spaces between human and vampire, between murderer and survivor, between the woman she'd been in the basement and the creature she was becoming. Victor had given her access to his archives. Centuries of journals, written in languages he'd learned and abandoned and relearned. Prague's golden age, Berlin's corruption, Vienna's decay. All of it filtered through the eyes of something that had watched from the shadows and taken notes. "Why show me all this?" she asked, reading accounts of kills from the 1920s, written in handwriting that grew steadier as the years progressed. "Because you're reaching the point where the real choice becomes apparent," Victor said. He sat across from her in the library, and for the first time, he looked tired. "At first, you chose not to die. That was easy. The basement had prepared you for any alternative to that. Then you chose to kill. Also relatively easy. Hunger makes predators of us all. But now comes the difficult choice." "What choice?" "Whether to be alone in this or to let someone truly know you," Victor said. "I've walked for 2 centuries and never permitted that. I've had lovers, companions, people I've shared blood with, but never anyone who knew me. Never anyone who looked at my gallery of the dead and didn't flinch away. The loneliness of immortality, Margaret, isn't the absence of people. It's the absence of being truly seen." Margaret closed the journal she was holding. "You're asking me to stay." "I'm asking you to choose," Victor corrected. "There are other vampires in the world. Some live in cities. Some have built entire societies beneath the surface of human consciousness. Some are older than I am, more powerful, less burdened by what they've done. You could find them. You could build an empire of hunger if that's what calls to you. Or you could stay here, In this apartment that exists between worlds, and we could be seen by each other. That's all I'm truly offering. Not salvation, not family, not redemption. Just the possibility of being witnessed. That night, Margaret stood before the gallery of the dead. She thought of the faces Victor had painted, each one rendered with such precision that they seemed more alive in oil than they ever had in flesh. She thought of her own portrait, waiting to be added. She thought of her husband, whose face she was already beginning to forget. She thought of the basement, and how 3 years of darkness had taught her that the only thing worse than suffering was suffering in isolation. "I'll stay," she said, "but I want to paint too." Victor's expression shifted, something close to relief, though immortals, he'd told her, should have learned not to feel relief. "Then you'll need your own easel, and you'll need to find your first subject, someone who matters enough to remember, someone whose death will change you." He pulled a leather journal from the shelf. "This is yours. Write their names. Paint their faces. Look at what you've done and refuse to become numb to it. That's the covenant we'll keep together, that we'll stay sharp enough to cut ourselves on our own monstrosity." Margaret held the journal. It was warm, as if Victor had been holding it for years, waiting for her to arrive. "If this story has already captured you," came a voice, though neither of them had spoken, "leave a like. It helps the voices of those who chose eternity reach more hearts." 3 months into her new existence, Margaret had added 6 faces to her gallery. Not all of them were kills. One was Victor, rendered as he appeared in his earliest journals, younger, more savage, the predator not yet tempered by the weight of centuries. Another was herself, captured in the mirror one dawn, her vampire form finally feeling like something she inhabited rather than something wearing her like a borrowed skin. Victor had become something closer to partner than mentor. They moved through the city together, not as hunters, but as witnesses. They attended concerts where they could hear the specific music each blood type carried in their veins. They visited museums to remember what beauty looked like before they learned to see it as fuel. They even, once, sat in a cafe during the brief twilight watching humans live at their frantic pace, and Victor told her about the woman he'd loved in 1887. "She was human," he said, stirring coffee he'd never drink. "A pianist. Extraordinary. I never told her what I was. I simply listened to her play and imagined a world where I could age alongside her, where my fingers could still create something beautiful instead of only destroying it." "What happened?" Margaret asked. "She died," Victor said simply. "Childbirth. And I was glad, actually. Relieved. Because it meant I wouldn't have to decide whether to turn her or to let her escape the knowledge of what I was. Death decided for both of us." Margaret recognized this for what it was, a confession, offered across the table like communion. An invitation to understand that even monsters could be haunted by love. Even creatures of the night could yearn for the light. "I've been thinking about eternity," Margaret said, "about what it means." "Don't," Victor advised. "Eternity is the death of meaning. It stretches everything thin. The only way to survive it is to stop thinking in terms of forever and start thinking in terms of now. This night, this prey, this choice. The moment you start calculating centuries, you start dying." He was right. Margaret had noticed that the older vampires tended toward a specific kind of emptiness, not despair, but a profound indifference. They'd hunted so long that nothing surprised them. Nothing mattered. They'd achieved a kind of death while still technically alive. That's when Margaret understood what Victor was offering her. Not immortality, that was a curse. Not companionship, that was a pleasant side effect. He was offering her the possibility of mattering, of building something that would last past her own hunger, past her own transformation. "I want to open something," she said suddenly. "A place, not a sanctuary for vampires. We don't need saving, but a place where those like us can come and bear witness to themselves. where we can paint and write and remember exactly what we are without pretense or redemption. Victor leaned back. A monastery of the damned. A monastery of honesty, Margaret corrected. A place where the gallery isn't hidden, where the portraits are displayed and the names are read aloud. Where anyone who chooses immortality knows exactly what they're choosing. Not escape, but a deeper kind of imprisonment. A commitment to seeing. He was quiet for a long time. Around them, the city hummed with ordinary human desperation. People rushing toward their deaths, unaware that death was rushing toward them too. The futility was beautiful in its way. "We'll need more than 2 immortals for something like that," Victor said finally. "We'll need to reach out to others. We'll need to convince them that their monstrosity deserves to be curated, not simply indulged." "Then, that's our next project," Margaret said. Victor smiled. That genuine smile that held actual warmth, the one that proved even creatures of the night could remember what hope tasted like. The monastery wasn't built so much as discovered. It existed in a series of connected rooms beneath Prague's oldest churches, spaces that had been consecrated and then forgotten, abandoned when the churches above were destroyed and rebuilt across centuries. Victor had known about them for nearly 100 years, but had never had a reason to enter them until Margaret suggested transformation. They worked through the daylight hours, when the sun made them nocturnal by choice rather than by nature. They hung portraits on the walls, not just Victor's and Margaret's, but paintings they commissioned from other immortals. A vampire from Barcelona who specialized in rendering the exact moment of kill. A creature from Tokyo who painted the internal experience of hunger. A being so old that no one could remember their name, who drew in charcoal the faces of everyone they'd killed in the first century of their existence. The gallery grew. The walls filled, the names accumulated. Then came the night when the first supplicant arrived. She was young, barely 30, turned against her will by someone who'd promised her love and delivered curse instead. She stood in the entrance of the monastery, terrified, and Margaret saw herself 6 months prior, broken, drowning, reaching for any lifeline that might save or destroy her. "What is this place?" the girl asked. "The only honest place I've found," Margaret answered, "where we don't pretend the hunger is gift, where we don't perform redemption, where we simply are. Monsters, yes, but monsters who refuse to hide from what we are." The girl looked at the walls, at the portraits, at the names, at the journals open on pedestals, detailing centuries of kills rendered in precise handwriting. "I hate what I've become," the girl said. "Good," Victor said, emerging from the shadows. "Hatred keeps you sharp. Acceptance is when the real death begins. This place exists because I spent 200 years hating what I was alone. Now, we hate it together. The weight becomes bearable when shared." The girl stayed. Others came. A banker who'd been turned in the 1990s. A soldier from the Napoleonic Wars who'd walked the earth for 2 centuries. A woman who'd chosen immortality specifically to escape a human life that was crushing her. They came seeking answers and found instead a gallery of honest monstrosity. Margaret began to paint more seriously. She created works that depicted not the moment of kill, but the moment of choice, the second before feeding, when the immortal could decide to take too much or take just enough. She painted Victor at 200 years old, still capable of tenderness. She painted herself, no longer in chains, but no longer truly free, suspended in the beautiful prison of eternity. The monastery became a kind of church for the damned, not a place of salvation. They'd learned salvation was a lie immortals told themselves, but a place of witnessing, where you could look at the gallery and see your own future mapped out in the faces of those who'd chosen darkness before you. "Do you regret it?" Margaret asked Victor one evening, as they stood before the newest addition to the gallery, a portrait of Margaret herself, painted by a vampire who saw in her something between predator and prey, neither fully one nor the other. "Regret is a human emotion," Victor said. "I've learned to replace it with understanding. I understand what I've done. I understand what I've become. I understand that there's no redemption for that. And somehow that understanding feels closer to peace than forgiveness ever could." Margaret took his hand. It was still warm. After 6 months, she could still be surprised by that. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For offering me a choice when all I'd known was cages. For showing me that even eternity could be bearable if you weren't bearing it alone." Victor squeezed her hand. Outside, Prague continued its ancient patterns. Humans being born and dying, living and forgetting, never knowing that beneath their feet the damned were learning to look directly at themselves. The final portrait went on the wall on a winter night that held the kind of silence only Prague could manufacture. It was Margaret's masterpiece, Victor rendered not in any single moment, but in all his moments at once. The young man he'd been in Prague in 1823, the predator he'd become, the weary philosopher he was at 2 centuries, and something beyond all of that, something that suggested the possibility of continued transformation. Around them, the monastery hummed with quiet purpose. The gallery had grown to hold over 300 portraits now. Other immortals had come and built their own wings, their own spaces for witnessing. There was talk of spreading the practice to other cities, not churches exactly, but monuments to honest damnation. "We've created something," Margaret said, stepping back from the final portrait. "I'm not sure what it is, but we've created something." "We've created a mirror," Victor corrected. "That's all any of us can really do. We reflect what we are back at ourselves so we don't disappear into the hunt, so we don't become empty things that wear our faces." Margaret thought about the woman in the basement 3 years earlier, with the bottle of pills and the certainty that death was mercy. She thought about how that woman had stood at a crossroads, not between life and death, but between 2 kinds of death: the quick death of pills or the slow death of eternity. She'd chosen the eternity, and in choosing it, had discovered that even eternal darkness could contain moments of light. "What happens now?" she asked. Victor moved to the window, where the snow fell across Prague in thick silence. "Now we continue. We paint, we hunt, we witness. We refuse to forget what we are. Somewhere in this city, there's another person in a basement, in a hospital, in a desperate situation, facing a choice they don't know they have. We'll find them eventually, and we'll offer them what was offered to me, not salvation, but the possibility of transformation, not redemption, but the chance to build something from the wreckage of what they were." He turned back to Margaret. "And we'll be here, in this monastery of the honest damned, with our gallery of faces and our journals of names, remembering that every immortal was once someone who chose not to die. Every monster was once someone who faced the final darkness and said no." Margaret moved beside him at the window. Together, they watched the snow fall across the living world, where humans rushed toward their deaths unaware. Together, they stood in the eternal present, neither quite alive nor quite dead, having made their choice and chosen to live with it. The portraits on the walls watched them in return. 300 faces, 300 stories, 300 individuals who'd accepted the only cure for immortality, the knowledge that they were not alone in being damned. "Subscribe if you believe mercy can resurrect even the damned," came a voice neither of them spoke, resonating through the monastery, through the city, through the night itself. "Like if you'd choose eternity for love that sees your soul. Comment eternal if you'd survive the night for someone worth dying for." And in the darkness beneath Prague, the immortals listened and added their own portraits to the gallery. One by one, night by night, forever and forever and forever, choosing to be witnessed, choosing to matter, choosing to continue. Not because they believed in redemption, but because they'd learned that eternity bearable is sometimes the only mercy monsters deserve. The gallery had grown beyond the underground chambers. What began as portraits on stone walls had evolved into something neither Victor nor Margaret could have predicted, a living archive of damnation that now occupied 3 city blocks beneath Prague, accessible only to those who'd already chosen eternity. Margaret stood in the central hall, observing the newest addition, a wing dedicated entirely to the stories of those who'd refused immortality. Humans who'd been offered transformation and declined, choosing death instead. Their portraits hung inverted, a visual reminder that rejection was also a choice worthy of witnessing. 47 refusals so far, each one rendered with the same precision as the kills, the same attention to the specific architecture of their final decision. "You've surpassed me," Victor said, appearing from the shadows the way he always did, not suddenly, but as if he'd always been there and had simply become visible. 5 years together, and Margaret still couldn't predict his movements. She wasn't sure if she wanted to. "The work has a momentum now," Margaret replied. "It's not us creating it anymore. It's the immortals themselves. They come, they see, they understand what honesty looks like, and then they want to contribute." Victor nodded slowly. Over the past 5 years, he'd aged in a way that had nothing to do with calendar time. His face carried the weight of 2 centuries and 5 years of watching others face their damnation. The burden of witnessing had deepened the lines around his eyes. "There's something we need to discuss," he said. "Another city has made contact, Vienna. They want to build a monastery there. They're asking if we'll help establish the protocols." Margaret had expected this. The movement had spread faster than she'd anticipated. Immortals in Berlin, in Budapest, in Istanbul, all reaching out, all wanting to build their own galleries of honest monstrosity. It was becoming something larger than either of them. "And if we do?" she asked. "Then we stop being isolated philosophers and become architects of something institutional," Victor said. "We create rules. We establish what can be shared and what must remain private. We become, in a sense, the priesthood of this religion we've accidentally built." Margaret walked deeper into the gallery. 5 years had added hundreds of new portraits to the collection. She recognized some of them. The banker from Barcelona who'd finally allowed himself to be painted after 3 years of resistance. The young woman from Tokyo who'd become Margaret's closest confidant, who taught her how to render the specific texture of remorse in watercolor. She recognized others only by their names in the journals. Artists she'd never met, immortals who'd contributed work and then moved on, leaving their mark on the monastery and disappearing back into the night. "What do you think would have happened if you hadn't found me in that basement?" Margaret asked. Victor was quiet for a long moment. "I would have found someone else, eventually. The work needed doing. But whether I would have had the courage to let someone truly know me, that I'm not certain. You made this possible, Margaret. You made the vulnerability necessary for the project to matter." Margaret turned to face him. In the candlelight of the gallery, his age was visible, not the age of decades, but of centuries, worn into the fabric of his being. He was beautiful in the way old things are beautiful, fractured, imperfect, made precious by the weight of time. "I want to go to Vienna with you," she said, "and then beyond. I want to see how this spreads. I want to understand what we've created." "That means leaving Prague," Victor warned. "This monastery will continue without us. There are others now who understand the work. But our departure means accepting that we're no longer the center of this. We're just 2 more immortals contributing to something larger than ourselves." "Isn't that what you said the whole point was?" Margaret smiled. "That monsters become less monstrous when they're witnessed. When they're part of a community, we've built that community. Maybe it's time to trust it." Victor extended his hand. After 5 years, Margaret still noticed the warmth of it, the proof that even creatures of the night could carry heat. They walked through the monastery one final time before departing. past the central gallery with its 300 original portraits, past the wing of refusals, past the archives where immortals from across Europe had contributed journals documenting their kills, their choices, their transformations, past the sculpture garden where a vampire from Barcelona had created abstract representations of the exact moment of feeding, the instant when predator and prey became something briefly unified. In the entrance hall, they found a gathering of immortals, 20 of them, perhaps more. The young woman from Tokyo, the banker from Barcelona, the soldier from the Napoleonic Wars, the woman who'd chosen immortality to escape a crushing human life. The girl who'd been the first supplicant, now confident enough to be considered an architect of the monastery's future. "We wanted to see you leave," the girl said simply, "to mark the moment." They stood together in the silence, a gathering of the damned, witnessing each other's departure the way they'd learned to witness everything, with honesty, without sentimentality, with the clear-eyed recognition that this was a choice made and a path chosen. "The monastery will continue," one of the older vampires said, "but it will become something different, more democratic, less dependent on the vision of any single immortal. Is that acceptable?" "It's necessary," Margaret answered. "Victor and I created this space, but the space belongs to all of you now." They embraced, not as lovers, not as family, but as the thing they'd all become, a community of monsters dedicated to the radical practice of honesty. Victor held each one briefly. Margaret did the same, storing the texture of each vampire's particular cold, the specific weight of their acknowledgement. Then, as Prague's bells rang midnight, they left. 6 months later, Vienna. The second monastery was larger than the first, built into catacombs that predated the city above. It had taken 3 months to prepare, another 3 to begin gathering immortals from across Central Europe. Margaret stood before the first portrait in the Vienna gallery, not painted by her or Victor, but by a vampire who'd been alone for nearly a century before learning about the monastery in Prague. The portrait was of a schoolteacher, someone the vampire had killed in 1987, rendered with such care that it seemed the painting itself was an act of mourning. "This is working," the vampire said, observing Margaret's observation. "Before Prague, I never looked at what I'd done. Now I can't stop. I paint every face I can remember. Some nights I create 3 portraits. Some nights I sit and just remember their names." "Is it helping?" Margaret asked. "No," the vampire said honestly. "But it's something. It's acknowledgement. In 2 centuries, that's more than I thought possible." Victor appeared beside them, as he always did. "The others want to gather. There are questions about how to structure things, how to prevent this from becoming performative." They convened in the central chamber. 50 immortals now, from a dozen countries, each with their own relationship to the work, their own reasons for contributing to the galleries of honest monstrosity. "We're creating a danger," one of the older vampires argued. "If humans ever discovered this place, discovered what we're doing, the paintings alone would be enough to trigger a hunt. We're leaving evidence of centuries of kills." "Perhaps that's the point," Margaret countered. "Perhaps the risk is the honesty. We're refusing to hide anymore. Not from ourselves, and not from whatever consequences that might bring. The moment we start calculating danger, we start performing redemption again." Victor listened without intervening. Over the past months, he'd gradually stepped back from leadership, allowing Margaret and the other immortals to shape the movement. It was a conscious choice, the recognition that his vision, while necessary to birth the monasteries, shouldn't be allowed to constrain their evolution. "I propose we expand," a younger vampire suggested. "Not just galleries of kills, but spaces for everything. For the immortals who've chosen to study instead of hunt. For those of us who feed on animals and feel shame about that. For the ancient ones who can barely remember their own names. Spaces for all kinds of honesty, not just the monstrosity." The suggestion sparked something. Hours of debate followed, not about whether to proceed, but about how to structure spaces for different kinds of immortals. By dawn, the Vienna monastery had evolved into something more complex than Prague's original vision. Not a church of damnation, but a city of honesty, where different aspects of the immortal experience could be witnessed and understood. 12 monasteries now existed: Paris, Berlin, Budapest, Amsterdam, Rome, Istanbul, Barcelona. Each one adapted to its location, its architecture, its particular community of immortals. Some emphasized the galleries, others built research libraries. One in Istanbul created a performance space where immortals could enact their most significant kills, turning murder into theater, into ritual, into something witnessed and contextualized. Margaret had stopped painting 6 months earlier, not from exhaustion, but from a sense of completion. She'd rendered enough faces to understand that the work didn't need her anymore. Younger immortals had emerged with better technical skills, deeper emotional sophistication, the ability to capture not just the moment of kill, but the specific regret or satisfaction that accompanied it. Instead, she'd turned to writing. Her journals had grown into manuscripts, into a theoretical framework for what they'd created. The Covenant of Seeing. She called it the radical practice of refusing to hide from what you are, of building community not around shared values, but around shared monstrosity. Victor had become something like an elder, though he resisted the title. He traveled between monasteries, observing, offering insights when asked, generally stepping back to let the younger immortals shape the movement's direction. On nights when Margaret found him alone, he seemed almost peaceful. Not happy exactly, but less burdened by the need to be the architect of something. "Do you think it's working?" Margaret asked him one evening, in a monastery in Berlin, surrounded by hundreds of portraits of the dead. "I think it's evolving," Victor replied. "Whether it's working depends on what we meant by work. We set out to create a space where immortals could be honest about what they are. We've done that. But I suspect what we've really created is a mirror that lets us see ourselves without flinching, and that's a very different thing." "Is that better or worse than what we imagined?" Margaret asked. "Neither," Victor said. "Just different. The best outcomes always are." Margaret stood in Prague, back where it all began, in the central gallery where Victor's portrait still held the place of honor. Around her, the walls had been reorganized. The oldest portraits had been moved to a separate section, labeled The First Witnesses, a nod to those who'd accepted monstrosity early, who'd helped establish the practices that now spread across Europe. Her own portrait hung nearby, but it had been repainted, not by her, but by a vampire who'd arrived in Prague only last year. In this new version, Margaret appeared not as she was during those first months of transformation, but as she was now, someone older, still beautiful, but marked by years of witnessing. The painting captured something between regret and acceptance, between the woman who'd asked for death and the immortal who'd chosen eternity. The girl who'd been the first supplicant, no longer a girl, now a coordinator of the Prague monastery, responsible for organizing the galleries and welcoming new arrivals, approached Margaret. "There's someone downstairs," the girl said, "in the holding chamber, similar to how you arrived. Someone fresh. Someone asking if there's another choice besides the basement or the grave." Margaret nodded slowly. 5 years, and they were still finding them, would always find them. The desperate, the broken, the people trapped between unlivable lives and the finality of death. "Have you shown her the gallery?" Margaret asked. "Not yet. Victor wanted you to decide." Margaret descended into the holding chamber, where a woman sat in near darkness, clearly terrified. She was thin in the way Margaret remembered being thin, not from hunger, but from the erosion of hope. Her wrists bore marks that could have been restraints or could have been scars from previous attempts at escape. "My name is Margaret," she said gently, "and I'm going to show you something that might change how you understand your options." She led the woman into the gallery, past the portraits of the dead, past the journals of immortals naming their kills, past the refusals and the transformations and the 300 stories of individuals who'd faced the edge of eternity and chosen to step across. "This is what we are," Margaret said simply. "Not saviors, not redeemed, not even particularly good at existing in your world anymore, but honest. And if you choose to stay, if you choose to become what I am, this is what you'll join. Not a family, not a sanctuary, but a community of the damned that refuses to hide from itself." The woman looked around the gallery. Margaret could see the moment the scales shifted in her eyes, the moment she understood that there was a third door between death and the basement. "How long does it take?" the woman asked. "The transformation? A few weeks," Margaret replied. "The acceptance of what you've become? That's a lifetime. We count in centuries here, but the real transformation, that's never complete." "And if I refuse?" "Then we have protocols for that too," Margaret said. "We help you die peacefully. No basement, no torture, just an end, witnessed and honored." The woman closed her eyes. Margaret waited. She'd learned not to rush this moment, not to lean toward either choice. The decision had to be genuinely the person's own. "I want to stay," the woman whispered. "I want to see what happens if I choose eternity." Margaret smiled. She thought of her own arrival, of Victor's hand warm in hers, of the 3 years that had followed, of the monastery that had emerged from grief and monstrosity, of the dozens of immortals now standing in galleries across Europe, finally seen. "Then we'll begin," Margaret said. "Welcome to the covenant. Welcome to the honest damned. Welcome to the beginning that follows every ending." And above them, in the cathedral silence of Prague, the portraits watched. 300 faces and growing, 300 stories and continuing. The gallery was no longer a record of what had been, but a prophecy of what would come. More immortals, more choices, more individuals refusing to hide from themselves or each other. The monastery was no longer a sanctuary or a church. It was a mirror. And in that mirror, the damned could finally see themselves as they truly were. Not monsters to be ashamed of, but creatures worthy of witness, worthy of memory, worthy of the eternity they'd chosen, the end of the beginning.